Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to this Demos event. My name's Polly Curtis and I'm Chief Executive of the cross-party think tank Demos. And we're delighted to welcome you all here and our very esteemed speakers as well for what is becoming an increasingly urgent and important conversation about the impact of generative AI on the forthcoming election season. Which we cover in a report we're publishing today with our partners at UCL. So welcome everyone. It's lovely to have you all here. I know that there are some absolutely brilliant voices and experience and people in the audience as well as on our panel. So I'm hoping to bring everyone into this conversation through the chat function as much as possible. I'm going to introduce our speakers and our partners on this project. And we're going to hear from them. But as I said, the expertise is very much in the audience as well. So I would really encourage participants to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, to prompt them to members of the panel and to us at Demos. And the last bit of housekeeping is that this event is being recorded. It will only record the panelists' faces and audios, but just to let everyone know it is being recorded. The report we're publishing today is called Synthetic Politics. Are we prepared for generative AI in 2024? And it's a real collaborative process between Demos and UCL, our partners who are part of this conversation today. And you can access it on our website. I think my colleague Hannah has just shared that link in the chat here for you all to have a look. So we have three absolutely brilliant speakers here today. Nigat Dad is founder and executive director of the Digital Rights Foundation, board member at Meta's Oversight Board, and member of the UN Secretary General's AI Advisory Board. Welcome, Nigat. And our two other panelists today are both the joint authors of the report we're publishing today. So Dr. Jeffrey Howard is Associate Professor of Political Philosophy and Public Policy and Director of the Digital Speech Lab at UCL. Welcome, Jeff. And Ellen Judson is a very old dear friend of Demos, now an independent researcher and a senior fellow at Demos. Ellen, welcome. So this project has been a partnership between Ellen and Jeff, and I'm going to start by asking them to kind of introduce some of the themes that have been coming through this project that you'll read about in that report, and then I'll turn to Nigat for her response to that, really. So Jeff, this report thinks about the risks in two phases: the kind of immediate short term, what are we facing this year? And then the longer term, much bigger challenge of how things are going to change with generative AI. So thinking first about the risks, what do you think the immediate risks are for this next year in this huge year of global democracy?
Well, thanks so much, Polly, and thanks to everyone who's joined us here today to discuss the launch of our report, Synthetic Politics. So let me just talk you through some of the immediate risks that we sketch out in the report. So to clarify, our report focuses on the risks in particular to the integrity of our democratic discourse, both here in the UK, but also across the democratic world. Now, needless to say, there's a lot of conversation in this space right now. There are other reports that have focused on specific dangers to, say, electoral integrity arising from, for example, AI-enabled cyber attacks on voting systems. But our concern in this report is really with the quality of our democratic conversation. And as we see it, the health of our democratic discourse relies upon three core norms that we think are put under strain by generative AI. So let me just talk you through what those norms are. So the first is the norm of equality. Now, this is the norm that requires citizens to treat each other with equal respect and affirm the equal right of everyone's voice to be heard and counted. The second norm is truth, which demands that citizens and their representatives deliberate sincerely with a shared, accurate understanding of basic facts. And the third democratic norm we focus on is nonviolence, which demands that citizens manage their disagreements through discussion and, of course, ultimately voting instead of intimidation and force, always respecting, we argue, the peaceful transition of power. Now, I think everyone here will acknowledge that over the past decade, these norms have come under serious strain through the production of a huge amount of harmful content. predominantly on social media networks. Our concern is that the pressing risk we face is that generative AI is going to supercharge the production, the dissemination, and the impact of this kind of content by making it cheaper to produce, faster to get around, and more impactful because it will be more persuasive. So start with some risks to equality. Hateful campaigns of bullying, harassment, defamation against women and minorities. These are already a ubiquitous part of our public sphere, and our worry is that they're going to get worse. So we can think of non-consensual, intimate deepfakes of female politicians, or chatbots offering personalized how-to templates for racist harassments, or racist stereotypes appearing in AI-generated imagery. Now, second, threats to truth are already under strain from varieties of misinformation, including malicious disinformation. We've seen chatbots give wrong information in response to queries about elections or reference non-existent newspaper articles. We've seen deepfakes of politicians confessing crimes that they never committed, or engaging in abusive behavior towards staff that they never engaged in. These falsehoods, we argue, inhibit democratic accountability, but it's more pernicious than that. They risk fueling growing distrust and even skepticism toward our institutions and our information. And then finally, norms of nonviolence can be subverted through chatbots producing ever more persuasive extremist propaganda, AI-powered robocalls that intimidate voters, and so on. So what should be done about all that in the short term? Let me just rattle off a few of the core recommendations we make in that space. So it's important to recognize the work that's already being done. So upstream developers of Gen AI models and public-facing user applications already have a lot of prohibitions on some categories of harmful content. Restrictions and guardrails are in place. Downstream, many of the risks that we set out are addressed by the policies of the major social media platforms under their content moderation rules. But unsurprisingly, given how new this threat is, it's just not enough. And so in the immediate term, it's going to be vital that relevant actors step up their efforts to limit the production, the dissemination, and the impact of harmful synthetic content. So consider first upstream, the companies that are developing AI foundation models and user applications. So in the report, we argue that these companies should develop and publish much more specific and comprehensive policies concerning the content that users may and may not generate, especially with respect to the content that undermines those core democratic values that I just told you about. So these policies should be the explicit basis of models' guardrails, which will create a symmetry between the expectations on users and expectations on the company itself. Right now, it's very unclear how these two sets of expectations relate. Further, we argue that these companies need to upscale their prompt hacking and red teaming exercises to identify and mitigate model misuse, and they need to tell the public about what they're doing in this regard. Now, further downstream, we argue social media platforms have an absolutely central role to play in managing the spaces where harmful synthetic content proliferates. And the key to success, in our view, lies not necessarily in creating new policies to ban generative AI content. We think a lot of Gen AI content has value. Rather, the key is to double down on the enforcement of good rules against harmful content, regardless of the technology that was used to create it. So, for example, if a deepfake is objectionable because it conveys harmful misinformation, it's that fact that's the reason for removing it, regardless of how it was produced. So we think we argue in the report that a lot of existing policies on platforms toward generative AI content are largely confused. Finally, let me just say that concurrent with the efforts, it's absolutely vital to empower citizens to be able to handle a democratic discourse that's suffused with generative AI content. Now, part of that's going to involve clearer communication with the public about the proper limits and uses of these tools. So developers of Gen AI applications really need to provide clearer and more prominent information to users about the potential inaccuracy of the content provided by chatbots in particular. They also need to step up efforts to watermark the contents produced by their tools as much as feasible in the short term. So many larger companies have already embedded watermarks in their tools. We also think that social media platforms should require their users to label synthetic content, including by automatically labeling synthetic content produced by their own in-house tools, and by enabling users to label their posts or suggest labeling of other posts. Now, that's not going to solve the problem. A lot of stuff is going to get through, but at least it's going to jumpstart the right kind of norms about labeling this kind of content. And just the very last thing to say, while it's difficult for public officials to react quickly to this challenge, there still is scope for action. So in a lot of different work in this space, Demos has been advocating across its work that political parties really need to develop a cross-party compact on how generative AI is to be used transparently and ethically in election campaigning to prevent the kind of digital arms race that we're all worried about. So that gives you some sense of the short-term risks that we're facing, but it's going to be a long-term battle, that's for sure.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jeff, for that really kind of comprehensive kind of analysis of that short-term phase, which feels to me is like a new marginal kind of increase in the kind of risks we've already experienced. And what you argue in the reports is to really double down on the existing kind of moderation policies and then look at some kind of societal kind of triggers which we could look at, such as this cross-party agreement, which I will be thrilled to come back on a little bit later and talk about a bit more, because it's something that's been very central to our work at Demos. But I just wanted to kind of first on the risks distinguish between those kind of short-term challenges and some of the potential solutions, and the kind of longer term, what might generative AI do to the quality of our democracy. Ellen, do you want to pick up on that point?
Absolutely, and thanks so much, and thank you everyone for being here today. Obviously, a lot of the risks that Jeff has just spoken to are particularly acute in this period of elections, this year of elections across the globe. But obviously, the first thing to note is that issues around these things like falsehoods, bias, hate, propaganda, and so forth, these aren't just electoral issues. And unfortunately, those risks are likely to continue throughout future years, election years or not, and risk exacerbating other political challenges, whether that's conflicts, social unrest, conspiracy theories, other key political events that come along. So a lot of the solutions that Jeff is talking about are things we think need to be brought in very quickly to deal with the election risks, but obviously are going to shape longer term responses as well. But I think these short-term risks really reflect the kind of longer term risks of these fundamental changes in our information environments, and in how AI tools are being designed and used in ways which affects how the content that makes up that crucial democratic conversation Jeff described, how that content is produced, how that content is shared and distributed. We're already seeing, obviously, generative AI tools being widely used by the public, being integrated into other digital technologies, becoming part of social media platforms for users to create content through, being used by organizations, businesses, media, politicians, government. And obviously the concern there is that then if we are building so much of our kind of communication infrastructure and information infrastructure on these tools, which may have been trained with data that has inaccuracies in it, bias in it, then we're going to see those inaccuracies and biases replicated throughout the environment. And then on the other side, there's this worry about this sort of homogenation of AI, where if the more content is produced by AI rather than by diverse groups of humans, we might see this sort of everything just taking on the same tone, the slightly strangely neutral tone of the sort of ChatGPT style chatbots, which itself then kind of removes some of that important diversity in the conversations that we're having. And things like high quality independent journalism or new creative ideas are going to find it harder to compete with sort of volume of AI produced content. We've already, we've been talking for many years about information disorder, information chaos, it being hard to trust information in this sort of confusing world in which we're bombarded with information all the time. And I think the real risk around generative AI is that it compounds those risks. It makes it more confusing, harder to navigate, less trustworthy, less trusted, and harder to really understand what content is, where it's come from, why it's been produced, and how it's been produced. So it's really, again, we've similar conversations as we've been having about social media platforms for years, is that we need digital technologies to be designed differently from the start, rather than kind of waiting until we get to these crisis moments, to election years or to a particular conflict or a particular period of unrest, and then trying to kind of retrofit safeguards, which we certainly need to do. But if we can be thinking about the long-term risks at the same time and start to develop technologies in different ways, I think that's really important for addressing those longer-term risks to democracy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ellen. I mean, it's really interesting. There's a kind of tension here because in the short term, there being so many elections this year creates some focus and attention that's desperately needed, but it also means you're trying to fix something in very febrile democratic moments that can mitigate against it as well. So thinking about a long-term plan, kind of slightly kind of between elections, is also a great idea as well. Nagat, you're based in Pakistan, which had elections last month. So give us a kind of reality check of how this is looking in a real live kind of election period. What can we expect in the UK?
Thank you so much. I'm always happy to give a reality check. Coming from global majority, it's important for us to remind folks in the global north, where mostly policies are being discussed or established around technology, to basically let them know that these technologies are actually impacting real lives in real time. And just to give you a little flavor of what happened in Pakistani elections last month, one of the political leader who's very famous, and not only in Pakistan, around the world, is being imprisoned. However, his political supporters and his party social media people basically used generative AI and did a virtual political rally where the political leader who is in prison actually was shown that he's talking to public in real time by using his previous speeches and previous imagery and videos. And from the outset, it doesn't look like there's a harmful generative AI. It's just, like people using their, like innovative use of generative AI and, like bringing a political leader in front of the people who is actually imprisoned. But I think it's very important to kind of look into, and maybe, I don't know whether Jeff or Alan has looked into that generative AI content, which is of political nature, but it's not harmful. How that adds into political discourse, especially when the emotions are charged, when the elections are just around the corner. It all happened in Pakistan on the eve of election or few days before election and generated huge conversation. And I think it also sort of shines the light on the issue, which is the structural one. It's the digital divide, or the lack of digital literacy. So masses who do not understand what is generative AI, what is AI actually, when they see something on their screen and it's their leader talking to them, it's difficult for them to identify whether he's the actual leader, or he's out of the jail, or he's giving this speech behind the bars. So you kind of create this weird kind of political environment where the elections are just in the next day. People are charged, they see their leader on their screens, and then they just go out and cast their vote. And I don't know how to measure this impact, but I think it's very important to see how it influences voters' mindset and their decision when they don't have enough space and time to process what they're watching or what they're consuming as a content. I would also, because I wear different hats. I sit on Matters Oversight Board as well, and at the board, we have long seen the protection of election as a serious problem. And in 2022, we officially made it one of our top priorities. And one example I want to share, which Jeff also mentioned around chief fakes, we have already been confronted with media manipulation, and this is a chief fake rather than a deep fake, and it was brought to light some really serious issues with existing policies at the company. So ahead of upcoming US elections, we actually released this decision on video content edited to make it appear as the current US President Joe Biden was inappropriately touching his adult granddaughter. And we found that the post did not violate Meta's existing manipulated media policy, in part because it was not generative AI content, and the alteration to the video was obvious. But we also found that this policy makes little sense. It bans altered videos that show people saying things that they did not say, but it does not prohibit posts depicting people doing something they did not do. And it only applies to videos created through AI. But let's talk about other fake content off the hook. So audio is not mentioned, despite being a key source of electoral mis and disinformation. So I'll stop here and see what other fellow panelists have to say in terms of recommendation and how we can address this issue.
Absolutely. I just wanted to come back on a couple of questions first. So one, the imprisoned political leader, were they transparent about the use of AI? Did they label it or tell people that that's what it was?
Yes, so the video was labeled as AI generated content, but as I said, that many people who consume this content, maybe in urban areas, people know what is AI or Gen AI, not all, but then 70% of our population live in the villages. They are on TikTok, they are, they watch this on YouTube channels. They don't know what this labeling means. So I think we also, when we are talking about labeling and watermarking and all these things around AI, generative AI, I think we also connect it with the existing inequalities around technology that is already there, and actually, sort of adding into the risk around generative AI content.
Yeah. And give us a flavor about how it affected the election coverage and the campaign. Did generative AI become a story in itself that people were talking about?
I think it was covered by several local and international media, that how political party used generative AI, but it was covered more like of, oh, look at the innovative use of generative AI. And no one was talking about how this is influencing or impacting political process, or for instance, election campaigning. And everyone was like, oh, like we also have to do this. So there was this like very weird kind of race that we witnessed among political parties on the eve of election, where they completely disregarded watermarking or labeling. And then we saw use of generative AI content, but not only for the election campaigning, but also deep fakes of women politicians or women journalists, to silence them, to harass them, or to basically suppress their voices online, because it was a very charged environment in Pakistan because of one political leader being imprisoned. Supporters of that leader, who actually celebrate their leader, was very, very charged and angry, and they were just anything that they were watching. I think that was a very good use of manipulating masses sentiment, basically.
In a strange way, it reminds me of an example here where a reporter at the BBC tracked down the creator of a cheap fake of the Mayor of London making some derogatory remarks. And the justification the creator of this content gave was, it doesn't matter that he didn't say it, because we know he thinks that. And the kind of wearing away of what's real, I mean, a completely different set of motives there compared with what was happening in Pakistan, but a wearing away of whether the truth actually matters versus where it represents something that is believed feels worrying to me. Like that worries me, even though the motives in this case were clearly right. So thinking about, Jeff, you started to kind of outline some of the kind of solutions that you recommend in the report, looking at really amplifying the efforts around existing content moderation. When we at Demos have looked at this more widely as well, kind of part of our calculation is kind of, if we have an election this year, which is very likely there's very unlikely to be time to legislate. We know that there is an arms race in the tech companies to try and do watermarking or tracking, but that they won't be fail-safe in time. We know that Ofcom has some new powers, but they are very unlikely to be kind of really deployed in time. I was left a bit kind of feeling a bit hopeless. Like, yes, there are existing kind of moderation rules that we could really apply and amplify at the tech companies, but thinking about what can be done this year, which is why we turn to this idea of trying to kind of negotiate this cross-party agreement that sets out how AI will be used in the individual campaigns, how politicians would treat content that they suspect to be produced by generative AI, and also puts an onus on the campaign teams having guidelines for all of their campaigners. And we've been having a lot of conversations behind the scenes to try and line up this cross-party agreement. And we're very clear that this is just a tiny part of the problem. The problem is much more likely to come from bad actors than the political establishment. But really, it's about kind of setting some norms and showing some leadership and marking out democratic leaders from a lot of the other activity that's happening on the internet. So, you know, really glad to see it in our joint report as well, kind of this idea of a cross-party agreement. But what hope do you have for this year safeguarding the UK elections?
My general sense is that there are people within the companies who do take trust and safety issues extremely seriously and are concerned with ensuring that their products are not abused or misused in ways that subvert democracy. And so I think it's really important that we, in the short term, direct our guidance and pressure toward the companies themselves, because they're the only ones that have the relevant tools to be able to make the relevant changes. And here, I think it's crucial to emphasize that when content is harmful, it's harmful regardless of whether it's communicated by human or machine. And there are these elaborate systems in place, fallible to be sure, but systems in place for detecting various kinds of harmful content. And it's incumbent upon platforms to ensure that they're vigorously enforcing those systems. And just as we had and this point will be a little more controversial, and it's not in the report, but just as during COVID, we had platforms had a higher tolerance for false positives, that is to say, a higher tolerance for taking down content that may not have technically violated the rules as collateral damage when taking down the content that did violate the rules, because by vigorously targeting the former, you end up vigorously targeting the latter, you end up catching more of the former. I think during an election season, we have to have a similarly tough stomach for these kinds of false positives in this kind of context. And so I think erring on the side of over removal is unpopular, but I think to prevent real problems in the course of an election, my own view is that it is the right response. And just the last thing to say on this, I do think the social media platforms are the entities that we have to direct most of our attention to, in large part because it's the technical challenge of installing accurate, reliable guardrails in the large language model space just seems to be absolutely gargantuan. And the engineers working on these systems continually seem to be surprised by the ways in which sophisticated adversaries can circumvent them. So I'm not very optimistic in the short term that the large language model companies are going to get a complete handle on the problem.
Nagat, do you want to come back on that, maybe with your Meta hat on?
Yeah, so I mean, I already mentioned one of the cases that we have decided, but elections is one of our 7 priorities, and we have already started looking into content around election, and I think audience will basically see very soon some of the cases that will come in the public domain. But I would also say that, if we look at the different social media platforms, I think Meta is taking this issue seriously and has arguably invested more to protect elections online than in other countries. I mean, it's not that I sit on the oversight board, but I have witnessed in Pakistani elections, different platforms responding to and how ready they were for elections in Pakistan. I'm seeing this in South Asia as well, the kind of pattern that how platforms are responding to civil society organizations and their concerns, are how they are responding to regulators in the country, how they are responding to government and political parties. But I have seen that Meta doing a lot of awareness raising, fact checking, things like that. I mean, I wouldn't say that that's enough, but that at least that's something, keeping in mind that there are some platforms which are still thriving, but absolutely have no human rights or trust and safety teams. So it has 40,000 people working on safety and security, and is building the largest independent fact-checking network with nearly 100 partners in 60 languages, and doing a lot of consultations with civil society. And companies also doing a fair bit on AI shortly after our decision, especially on President Biden. They announced during Munich Security Conference, if you were following, the industry partners came together and created this common technical standards for identifying AI content, and did some compact around looking into generative AI content around elections. So the company has it plans to start labeling images that its system flag as AI generates, mirroring what the board has recommended. But I would say the stakes are high, and more needs to be done, and not just by companies, but also by governments and civil society, who really must work together on this. And there are some questions that I have seen about what governments should do and what companies should do. And I would say, learn from elections that are taking place or have taken place, learn from them and try to quickly apply those, harms that they have witnessed in recent elections, and see how they can mitigate those harms in their own elections. This is a big election year. Everywhere elections will be taking place. You guys are already talking about UK. And I would say this particular recommendation around political parties, coming together on one table and doing a compact or something like that. I think this is the best way to do it. Getting commitment from political parties is a huge task, and good luck with that. But I think this is the important task. First and foremost is commitment from political parties, and then how election commissions are actually also ready to monitor and supervise and hold political parties accountable, besides companies, social media companies also accountable.
There's a really good, I'm going to come on to ask Ellen about kind of some of the longer term solutions, but actually there's a really good question from the audience, from an anonymous member of the audience, about how you deal with this in very kind of political context. So the question is, how do you think platforms should navigate accusations of political bias or censorship when removing content, particularly in cases where a particular political movement or group is sharing higher levels of misleading AI content? Like, the difficulty of doing this in a live a kind of political moment is that the whole thing could get very politicized. What do you think the challenge for the platforms is in that context? Maybe I'll come to Jeff and then Nagat on that.
So this is a familiar worry. So suppose it's true that, take the US context, suppose it's true that the Republican politicians are more likely to breach platform rules than politicians on the other side of the political spectrum. If that's true, then an even-handed application of the rules is going to lead to more enforcement action taken against Republicans. That will then lead to this kind of complaint of unfairness. So one way to respond to that would be to under-enforce the rules against Republicans to eliminate the complaint, but that would clearly not be the right solution. The solution has to be first be sure that you are, in fact, enforcing the rules in an even-handed, fair way, that people on both sides of the political spectrum who violate the rules are going to receive the same kind of treatment. And if a platform is sure that it is applying the even-handed rules in that way, then it becomes a fraught public relations problem. But it isn't a fundamental policy problem. It's a problem of communication. How can they convey to the public that they are, in fact, applying their rules in an accurate, in a fair way? One way to enable that, I think, is to be very transparent about how their internal processes are working, to open themselves up to the scrutiny of civil society organizations and researchers who are able to then independently corroborate that, in fact, the rules are being applied in an even-handed way. But I don't think there's any other solution than that, certainly not to stop applying the rules in an even-handed way.
Yeah, Nagat, what do you think?
I mean, definitely, transparency is the key. We have been saying this from the board's platform. And we made sure, that in some of our decisions, especially the Biden one that I mentioned, that, Meta take down those posts. But we were really concerned that this happened, why this happened at all, and almost 2 years to the day after storming of the US Capitol. That raises a lot of questions in terms of, like what companies basically have been done or have learned. And to stop this happening again, the board has pushed Meta to commit to sharing election monitoring metrics that will clearly show what steps the company has taken and whether its efforts worked or not. And so this particular effort is being launched in the last half of the 2024, which will hopefully be in the time for the UK elections, but will sadly not be ready before places like India or South Africa, or, like, for instance, Pakistani elections and Bangladeshi elections have already taken place. And that's why I always say that, whether are you thinking equally about global majority and global north,
And why we're so pleased you're here to kind of correct some of that imbalance as well in this conversation. Thank you. I think I've heard it from the other side as well, from the platforms who are worried about getting into a live political moment and the parties disputing whether something is real or not. So they end up having to make a very political decision. So we're thinking a lot about how you might have kind of, those touch points in elections where actually there could be cross-party agreement that it will be, that people will support decisions that are made, so it doesn't become a huge kind of row in itself. I'd love to come back to Ellen now to think about kind of I've heard clearly that there are things that social media platforms can do, there's things that politicians can do, there's kind of efforts that can be made in other areas but might be too slow for this election kind of period. But Ellen, kind of putting aside kind of the live political moment and thinking like a 5-year plan or a kind of before the next election plan, what should the longer view on the solutions be?
Definitely. So I think there's one thing that's come out really strongly from the conversation so far is that there is still a lot of uncertainty about exactly what the effects of AI are going to be on these various harms that we're concerned about. There's a lot of lessons we've learned from disinformation campaigns, from social media, how things have gone over the last few years. That I'd say we have fairly educated guesses about how things are going to go. But I would really kind of echo the call for there needs to be more research over what does come to pass throughout the election period to see really, okay, which harms really are being amplified, and then which responses are successful or not. There's been some elements of research on labeling that suggests it might make people trust in content less, other things that might make people trust in content more. It's things like that we need to work on, and we can't do that without data access from social media platforms, which has always been the kind of civil society drumbeat as the gates to data access have been coming down over the last couple of years. So I think that kind of transparency and availability of data is the kind of bare minimum we need to even be able to start thinking about the longer term solutions. But in terms of kind of what efforts I think we need to see from stakeholders beyond that bare minimum, I think regulation of technologies is key. And I think there may have even been a question, someone asking about how should governments kind of manage these risks without getting into complicated freedom of expression problems with regulating different kinds of content. And I think really it's that answer about regulating the technologies which are changing the way that content is produced and disseminated, rather than focusing on just, what other kinds of content do we need to make illegal, do we need to ban, or any of the rest of it, but thinking what changes need to be put in place so that the technologies are designed in different ways. So the EU is obviously leading the pack a bit in this area with the AI Act, obviously the Digital Services Act as well in terms of social media platform accountability, but particularly thinking about kind of generative AI tools, the AI Act coming in, bringing in these new responsibilities around risk assessments, particularly for high risk AI models and systems, where companies will have to assess against risks, take steps to mitigate them where they're identified. And even if they don't have to do those risk assessments, if they're sort of lower risk products, they'd still have transparency requirements and reporting requirements to try and reduce some of those kind of inbuilt design risks. Obviously, the UK has been sort of thinking about going in the direction of regulation, and we had the AI white paper, but I think it's going to be a little while before that comes to fruition. And I think that there will be a lot of lessons that can be usefully learned from the EU experience of how the bringing in the AI Act and developing that has gone that could be applied. I also think with the trouble with regulation is that it tends to focus on the very high risk security threats more so than the kind of democratic threats that we've been talking about here today. And that often there can be a slippage towards focusing on transparency as kind of the solution to everything. As long as the companies just tell us how they're building things, then that's good enough, even if the way that they're building things is actually not one that would be particularly promoting of democracy and human rights. So I think there's also a real kind of market challenge, because the market does not favor human rights by design in digital technologies. Commercial imperatives demand that AI tools and social media platforms are fun and engaging and useful and can make lots of money, but not that they necessarily lead to good outcomes for democracy. So I think there's a real role for funders, whether that's government funders, philanthropists, venture capital, those who are putting money into the system to develop new kinds of technologies and really kind of build this AI innovation, to really pursue this idea of designing things differently, designing AI for the public interest, with democratic outputs in mind, with human rights in mind, because I think in the end, money is the thing that's really going to make the difference here.
Nighat, what do you make of that? I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, no, definitely, for social media companies and other actors who are designing and deploying tools, I think designing and deploying these tools, I think best standards and practices need to be employed that protect freedom of expression, that look into harms, not only harms in general, but also harms from the marginalized groups' perspective, and keeping in mind different vulnerabilities of different vulnerable communities and in the global majority as well. We really need to strive to protect everyone, and not just those who deem politically and economically important to the companies and to other stakeholders. And I think what Jeff already mentioned, combining this with a firm commitment to transparency, to also not to the users, but also to restore trust. Trust has been eroded among different stakeholders and users, and I think it's equally it's as a responsibility of platforms and governments, and I think civil society as well, to how to restore that trust is really important. And people need to see, laymen who are the users really need to see where this information and other harmful content is coming from, and the impact that it is having in different spaces. So companies really need to be clear what they're doing to counter it, and what they are doing to invest more in media literacy or being transparent, or how they are best equipping their own users to spot malicious and false political information. I'm bringing board back again, because we have done a lot of work around this, and for the last 3 and 5 years, we are actually sharing what we have learned in terms of our transparency reports as well, and we are soon going to publish some of our own research and data for academics and other platforms who are working in this space, to make ourselves more transparent as well, and the kind of data that we had a privilege to get access to with the platform.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to bring in some of the audience's questions now, starting with our colleague Elizabeth Seeger, who asks, what do you see as some of the biggest barriers or challenges to mitigating adverse influences of Gen AI on democracy? I'm going to put that briefly to kind of each of you, if that's okay. Jeff, what do you think the biggest barriers and challenges are?
Well, I think even if the big players all agree to the right kind of watermarking protocols such that platforms can reliably identify what kind of content coming in is synthetic and label it accordingly, all you need is smaller players to refuse to comply with the relevant protocols to bypass that system. And this will be a disaster when it comes to various kinds of harmful content. So it's not like social media where so long as you catch most of it, the problem will be solved, because you could have deep fakes that are produced using tools that don't comply with the content rules that we favor, that could nevertheless go viral, that won't be detected as synthetic. So I do think that there's huge scope for nefarious action in this space. That's very, very concerning, and the technical limitations seem to me to be quite grave.
Yeah, thank you. Ellen?
I think mine would be a similar one of just the pace of technological development always outpacing regulation, and the ability of kind of governments and policy to catch up with, to understand the technology, first of all, to understand what the risks are, to understand how to respond to it, to then bring about mechanisms to respond to it. We always seem to be just a few years too late, and we're only just kind of getting to grips with thinking about regulating social media, and now something else has come along, and no doubt in another 5 years there'll be something that none of us have even thought of yet, which is changing the technological landscape and the risks to users. So I think that kind of constant playing catch up is a real challenge.
It's a really good point that actually our ways of legislating are a barrier in themselves, actually the kind of pace and nature of how we make laws. Nagat?
Yeah, I mean, I think my challenge with questions like this is, are we only talking about democracies, or are we also talking about democracies who are at the brink of, sort of erasure? And I'm really worried about some of the countries who where, especially in the global south, where different actors are actually absolutely have no idea about these conversations that are taking place in this part of the world, around not only innovation but harms, but also global governance. And I think a real challenge at the moment for democracies should be that, like, not only address these while thinking about themselves or their own jurisdictions and sovereignties, but also think about rest of the world, how they are bringing them into this conversation and taking them along. Because the existing inequalities in this space, I worry that it'll actually become more broader because of the conversations and the legislations and the innovation that is taking place, and global majority is absolutely, isolated in this space.
Yeah, any new concentration on power can further entrench existing inequalities and tend to thrive on it. So that's a really, really a good point. One of the barriers I have in my own thinking about this is really kind of assessing what the nature of the change is. And so often we think about it in terms of how we create content, or how content is created with generative AI. So thinking about deepfakes and cheapfakes and impact on misinformation, disinformation. The bit I'm really interested in at the moment is how it's going to change the nature of the distribution of information, how people will access information. And if you think about the offline world to the social media world, what a huge difference that's been in terms of the flow of information. Is it going to be as big as that when everybody's receiving all their information through one chatbot, potentially? And the potential and the risk for real persuasion and personalization in that space? So kind of the real shift in nature. I'd love to hear each of your reflections just on that. And I'll go in reverse order and start with Nagat this time.
Sorry, Polly, can you rephrase that?
My question is, so is this change just about how we produce content, or is it about how we consume content? And if generative AI is going to lead to a much more personalized, targeted, and persuasive content, how will that affect democracy?
I don't know. I mean, at the moment, I think it's a lot of uncertainty around this space. Every day, you see new things that your communities or groups around you or your networks. I mean, I'm talking about my own country where people do not even care whether this is synthetic media or generative AI. As long as it confirms their bias, they are okay with that. And I'm seeing that content more and more. I think accessibility of how to generate that content is also becoming very easy. And I think we also kind of need to see that there are like regulations in the EU, and US also came up with a regulation, and UK is going to adopt that path as well. But we are nowhere close to actually think about how a regulation should look like for a country like Pakistan or Bangladesh or India, for instance, which has like millions of population. And I think that worries me, that we are so behind that we won't be able to even catch up and look into the harm, let alone controlling it.
Thank you so much for that, Ellen. What are the new risks around persuasion and personalization with generative AI for democracy?
Yes, I think that, I mean, firstly, I'd say on the sort of creation distribution, I think my prediction would be that those two will increasingly kind of merge. I know in the report, obviously, we talk a lot about social media companies and AI companies, often as quite separate things. But I think that they're already beginning to, social media companies already beginning to integrate these products into their services, search engines beginning to integrate generative AI. So I think there'll be a huge overlap. I think some of the risks of the risks of that overlap and of this increasing personalization that would be possible, is again the kind of contribution to information disorder or confusion over navigation. People not knowing where they're getting this information from, why they're seeing it. We already know that obviously through kind of data-driven targeting, people are served personalized information that they may have no idea that the reason they're being served that is because they accepted cookies on some website 3 months ago, and now they're being targeted with advertising. I think it adds to that kind of confusion around where things are coming from. And obviously, I think there's a disinformation risk of being able to make even more accurate and manipulative content. I guess I would try and mitigate my own doom and gloom a little bit, and add that I think there is an opportunity around personalization, because if you do have these tools where you can access information, but you can ask for it to be presented to you in a way that makes it easier for you to understand, makes it more accessible. Can you please rewrite that in a different tone, or explain this concept to me a bit more, in a way that current search engines as they stand, you have to know what keywords to search for, and if you haven't got the right outcome, then you have to sort of think of it yourself. I think there could be really amazing opportunities for access to information, but it's got to be kind of managed in the right way.
Jeff, your thoughts on the same question about personalization?
Yeah, I mean, the story broke last week that Apple's in talks with Google to build Gemini into the iPhone as a kind of replace for Siri, and that will be they've also had talks with OpenAI, so it seems to be perhaps a bidding war at this point, but that's going to be absolutely transformative. And I'm worried about whether we're going to be able to steer a middle course between two dystopias on either side. So one is this kind of flattening and homogenization of public discourse, where you have Gemini as this kind of oracle authority in everyone's pocket. And that's going to be a problem if it gives too similar answers to everybody, because it's going to, because you might think democracy depends upon a plurality of different contesting perspectives being simultaneously aired. And how can Gemini do that? So that's like one problem. And then the other side is the excessively personalized experience, whereby the echo chambers and filter bubbles we've seen from social media, they're nothing compared to what's going to happen when we have completely different oracles offering completely incompatible perspectives in everyone's pocket, especially if it's doing it in a way that's going to try to hold your engagement with it, or whatever else would be the. So I think that we're in a really, really terrifying moment where I think Ellen's right. We do need to be thinking about these bigger question of, are we serving democratic values from the design moment up?
I can't leave our guests and our audience caught between two dystopias and terrified. Like it's too much. So I'm going to do the slightly hopeful / deluded thing of asking each of you to answer actually Elizabeth's question in the chat. Kind of, what are the opportunities for AI to help support and strengthen democracy? I believe there are some. Where do you think the opportunity, if we got this completely right, how could AI help strengthen democracy? So as a rounding up, kind of 60 seconds from each of you, maybe. Nagat, do you want to go first?
I mean, the first case that I mentioned around elections in Pakistan could be opportunities for some, but could be harmful content for some. So I think we need to look into opportunities that way. But I would say that, in this conversation, we all have realized that we all need to play a part here. And we are not only talking about platforms and companies, but also governments and civil society. And I don't know what opportunities AI is bringing into this space, but I would definitely say that there is a real opportunity for powerful actors and global north to engage with civil society and build their capacity. So when it comes to holding their governments and companies in their jurisdiction accountable, they are equipped enough to do so. They are equipped enough to produce researches and studies, the one that you have launched today. I would like to see the similar kind of work being done in global majority as well. And I think AI is bringing this opportunity where we can address existing inequalities around technology and human rights that we have seen in the last couple of decades.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ellen. Give us some hope.
I'll do my best. I mean, I think it's really around the kind of potential that generative AI has to make communication and information access and information synthesis easier. We've seen the kind of democratic value that comes from projects which take the sort of mysterious language of Hansard and translate it into, what has your MP said about this issue? What do they think? What's their voting record? And presenting things in a way that citizens can really engage with and understand. And I also think that there's that kind of the speed and ability of these tools to free up resources for whether it's a sort of smaller campaigner, a small campaigning organization that wants to kind of get a voice in the discourse, but just doesn't have as much money as some of the established players, small public independent journalists and journalism outfits, which again might be struggling to compete. If there are ways that these tools can be developed that mitigate the harms sufficiently to enable that kind of potential, I think it could really help increase the participation and the diversity of public discourse.
Fantastic. Jeff.
So in the report, just as we do some doom and gloom in the beginning with respect to those core values of equality, of truth, of nonviolence, and the ways in which various kinds of synthetic content might undermine the achievement of those norms. And at the second half of the report, we go through a bit more speculatively some ways in the long term that synthetic content might be used to bolster those three norms and promote a public discourse committed to those values. And so I'll just give one example. There's a wonderful paper by Lisa Argyle and co-authors, and the title of the paper is AI Chat Assistants Can Improve Conversations About Divisive Topics. And it's about the ways in which large language models might be used to suggest alternative formulations of one's post in a way that's more constructive, that's less divisive. And so if we think of these models as offering as these kind of assistants to help us improve our activities as democratic citizens. We could imagine them being built into social media platforms for the purpose of improving discourse in this way. I think that's just one of many really intriguing possibilities for how we might improve democracy rather than sabotage it if we get the governance of these models right.
Fantastic, thank you. And I would really urge everyone in the audience to go on our website and download the report and have a good read, because it's got so much of what we talked about today and more. So I'd really urge people to have a look at that and do get in touch. Let us know what you think. We're really keen to kind of hear your feedback and take it forward into future projects. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, Nagat Dad, Ellen Judson, and Jeff Howard, and particularly to Jeff for partnering with us and Ellen on this project together, and for creating such a useful contribution to the conversation, particularly at this point in the UK. So a huge thank you to you all, a huge thank you to the audience for joining. Do get in touch, let us know what you think. We're always keen to hear, and do come back to another Demos event in the future. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day. Thank you. Bye-bye.